Okay, today is August 23rd, 2008. I am Rob Campbell and I am sitting here with Dick Schleusener at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, and we are going to talk about the T28 storm penetrating aircraft. Dick, thank you for coming today. We appreciate your time.
I apologize for letting it slip my schedule.
That's okay. I think it's the end of summer and everyone's just scrambling before school starts. So could we start with just a little bit of your biography? Just tell us where you come from, what your background is, and how it is that you came to School of Mines and the T28 program.
Okay, I came here in December of 1964. My background is I'm a native Nebraskan. I was born and raised on a dry land farm in south central Nebraska, where it was subject to the usual vagaries of dry land farming in that part of the country. Ranging typically with low rainfall and occasional severe storms and hail, including an experience with a major tornado that came through the community in 1946, I believe it was. Destroyed a neighbor's house and killed a lady there, and three other people in the house were in the house when it was leveled. But survived the storm with no injuries. And I then went to school at the University of Nebraska. I got a degree in agricultural engineering in 1949, and had missed the tail end of World War II. So I was very much ripe for the draft at the time the Korean War came along, and took the occasion to get myself enlisted in the Air Force. I went to Air Force OCS for 6 months and became a second lieutenant, at which time a number of individuals from the United States Air Force Air Weather Service made the rounds there looking for new people with a background in science and math. And I fit the bill, and I volunteered for the program and was accepted and spent a year going to school at MIT, learning to be a meteorologist. Then spent 3 years on active duty before I decided to return to civilian life and continue a PhD program at Colorado State University. At Colorado State University, my background there was such that I had been interested in weather modification, in part from the experience at MIT, where a group of scientists from Australia came and gave some talks about their experience and showed a radar scope where an airplane was flying across the scope, and after the airplane flew by dispersing the seeding material, there was a band of precipitation there. So it's pretty hard to argue with something like that. So with that as background, I studied more about it. And shortly after I came there, a group of farmers from Sterling, Colorado came into Fort Collins asking for some help in trying to evaluate what was going on in their community, with a cloud seeding program going on to try to reduce hail damage to their crops. So I ended up writing a proposal to the NSF, got some support, and began working on the details of looking at what are the effects of cloud seeding on hailstorms. So that program continued for a number of years. I became somewhat recognized for the work that I was doing there, and subsequent to that, there was some activity going on in South Dakota, largely through the interest of Senator Carl Munt. And as a result of that, the Bureau of Reclamation got involved in the program. And I was offered the job of the director of the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences here at TET, and then accepted that offer and arrived here in late December of 64. And that then led to the development of a program here. So that was how I got to South Dakota.
You mentioned Carl Munt. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Tell me what you know about his involvement in this. What was his role, you said?
Well, part of the background of weather modification is the President's Advisory Committee for Weather Control, which was a group that was put together in 1955, I believe it was, trying to evaluate the effects of weather modification with what was known at that time. And the chairman of that particular group was Captain Orville, who was a Navy captain, who happened to be Dick Orville's father, or Harry, well, Tom, Dick, and Harry,
right.
Three sons. Tom is a businessman, Dick and Harry are both meteorologists, and when I was putting together a staff here after I'd arrived, Harry Ervil was one of the people that I thought who had just finishing his graduate program at the University of Arizona. So Harry came here and had spent his career here at South Dakota Tech, and now has subsequently has retired.
Right.
And he still has. I don't know whether you talked to him or not.
I talked to him last week.
Good.
Yeah, and he forgot to mention his father.
Okay.
He was very humble about these things. So was it you who brought Harry to School of Mines?
Yes.
But you did not, this is right at the beginning of the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences.
I think the institute began in 1949.
Right.
I didn't.
But
bring
you
it-
didn't start up IAS.
No.
Were you eventually the head of IAS?
I came as a director of the institute.
You came as the director, okay,
Yeah.
but not the first director.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you first just give a little, what was the IAS when you arrived? What was going on? What were they doing? How big was it? How were they funded, et cetera?
They were in the process of trying to get a field program going and having some difficulty getting all the pieces put together. So I was interviewed by President Partlow at the time and was hired by him as a consultant to help them set up their field program, which was my first association with Tech. And as a result of that, the offer came to come here permanently and to become the director of the Institute, which then I accepted and arrived here in December of '64.
So can you tell me so how long were you director?
I was a director until I became the Dean of Engineering in 1975, I believe it was.
Okay. So can you tell us about your early years at IAS?
Well, when I first came here, there was no office. There was the then director of the experiment station, was Joe Cope, who'd been at Tech for many years, and Hoyt Hart, who was then the principal staff person at the Institute. Two people had their own offices. When I came, there was no office set up, no structure. So it was coming in brand new, and the first task was to get things set up and running. So that was a part of the effort.
So what were your priorities as you came in as director? What did you want to do? What did you want to get done?
Well, part of the effort, part of the goal was to establish the beneficial effects of cloud seeding, and part of that was to create an institute that had sufficient scientific merit that it would gain acceptance in the scientific community.
So when Harry and I talked, I think he agreed that if there are weather mod optimists and weather mod skepticists,
Yeah.
he's on the optimist side.
Okay.
Are you on that side?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
were you on that side?
I was and am.
Were you a gung-ho advocate for weather modification?
I was probably considered as such.
Okay. Okay. So who was funding the IAS in your early years? Who was funding the research, the programs, the projects?
The funding came from a combination of the Bureau of Reclamation, the National Science Foundation, and miscellaneous other sources. Most of it came from the Bureau of Reclamation and the National Science Foundation.
So can you tell me about Project Hail Swath?
Project Hail Swath.
Do I have the name right?
Probably. This is one of the first major field projects that we had here after I had arrived, and involved inviting in a number of groups to have a concentrated look at hailstorms in the area with some seeding going on. And it was at that time that Paul McCready was here, and he came up with the idea of the armored airplane.
That's right. Can I ask you to tell me just about Paul McCready in general, to the extent that you knew him? Did you worked with him? Did you know him? And just tell me about Paul McCready. I won't get to talk to Paul McCready now, since unfortunately he passed away.
Paul McCready was a great guy. I first met him when I was at Colorado State University, when I was making the rounds visiting various projects in various areas, various activities going on. I went out to California to visit some people out there, including Paul McCready. And I had also had been to Arizona to a project he was running out of Flagstaff, Arizona.
And so was he involved, did he come to Rapid City? Was he involved in Project Hail Swath and activities at IAS?
Yes, he was one of the participants in Project Hail Swath.
So what would his role have been? Was he as a researcher or as a supplier of airplanes, or?
He did not supply airplanes. He was here as a researcher, just observing what was going on and adding his inputs to it from his background and experience.
And the reason I ask about Paul McCready is that his name always comes up when people talk about the origin of the T28.
Yeah.
Project Hail Swath was before this plane was operational.
That's right.
What kind of aircraft did you have for? I guess you wouldn't call it cloud penetration, but what kind of aircraft were you using to gather data before the T28?
The airplane used for seeding was a North American AT-6. It was an Air Force trainer plane. And we may have had an observation plane. I don't remember what all we had at the time.
And these were not highly modified aircraft. These were.
Well, the T-6 was modified to the extent of fitting seating devices to it for a seating airplane. The observing airplanes at that time were pretty crude by what's available now.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, the first cloud observing, or the first aircraft observing equipment was just in the process of being developed at that time.
Now, and maybe you can explain to me, someone who really doesn't know anything about meteorology or cloud research or anything, when you say an observing airplane, what does that mean?
It started out to be very simple things that I personally was involved in. The question of whether or not the existing clouds on a summer day over Rapid City do or do not have ice particles in it. And the process is very simple. Put a glove on and sit in an airplane, open the windows, put it out. If there's ice particles in the cloud, it'll come bouncing off your head and hit you in the nose. So starting from that as a concept, is there ice presence or not? With that kind of toolery, it's now developed to a stage where using laser and other devices, it's possible to get a complete spectrum of the size of particles in the cloud, ranging from this very small cloud particle size to the larger ice pellet size.
But that's not as fun as putting on a glove and sticking it out the window.
It's a little more complicated than that.
So you personally flew in an airplane, stuck your hand out the window?
Yes, I did.
That's something you... I think that's great. So when you say observing aircraft, you're not talking about visual observation from outside the cloud. You mean in situ, data gathering from inside the cloud?
Both.
Okay. So you were cloud penetrating, but not storm penetrating. These clouds that you would go into at that stage before the T28, these are storm clouds, or these are
typically less than storm clouds.
Mm-hmm. So sort of afternoon cumulus cloud, but not dark and threatening and lightning and all of that.
That's right.
Okay. So I'm not sure how to phrase this as a question, but I'll just give you my impression. You tell me if this is right. Maybe it's just stories that I hear, but my impression of the early days of the IAS, or maybe the mid-late 60s at IAS, is that you folks had planes and radars and people and students all over the place, that this was quite a bustling program with a lot of money. Is that an accurate perception, or is that?
It's a pretty good perception. At one time we had an observing site that included a radar and taking radar measurements and getting a record of this at 3 different locations, one here at Rapid City on the Nike side east of town, another at Watford City in North Dakota, and another near Alliance, Nebraska.
And so were these all specifically research radar, or were these sort of airport radar that you were using for research, if you know what I mean?
They were surplus radar that the Army had used for their missile sites.
Oh.
And that was one of the things that my predecessor in the early days of the Institute of Atmospherics, Atmospheric Science, had decided to accumulate surplus equipment that was available at low cost or no cost. And they accumulated quite a collection of the radar that was used for the missile sites.
So were these radar appropriate? Were they especially good for the research you were doing?
They operated on a 10-centimeter wavelength. Most of the current modern radars operated on a 5-centimeter wavelength, and some of the equipment that we use were 3 centimeters. Each of these had different characteristics and different primary uses. For example, the 10-centimeter that was used would not be covered. So the 10-centimeter, you could see through one cloud to see another cloud.
You could or could not?
You could, as opposed to 3 centimeter, where the inverse is true.
So the 10 centimeter actually has some advantages, some disadvantages.
It's a
Trade-offs.
trade-off.
Okay. Okay.
And the system that we used out at the Nike site was one to use the 10 centimeter to observe the precipitation areas, and used a tracking system that had a built-in tracking system that was used to track incoming enemy vehicles. It was used to track the location over time with the seeding airplane.
Since you mentioned that these were old Army radars, what was the relationship of this meteorology research community, or you folks specifically, with the military?
We didn't have any direct tie with the military here at Ellsworth. However, there were some military researchers that we did deal with and were involved in the Project Ellsworth.
So these were active, what, Air Force people or Army people, or?
I believe they were Air Force.
And they were just meteorologists, they were scientists like you?
That's right.
And so they had a lot of the same interests because?
Yes.
Okay.
And they were stationed at Hanscom Air Force Base in Massachusetts. Where incidentally, I had lived for a year when I was going to MIT.
Did you have anything to do with the base?
Just the fact that I lived there.
Oh, okay. Where is, you said Hanscom, Massachusetts?
Hanscom Air Force Base in Massachusetts, outside of Cambridge.
Oh, I didn't know there was an Air Force base outside of Cambridge. Is it now gone?
I'm not sure. I suspect it probably is gone.
Okay. It seems to me when I do interviews with people and talk to people, a lot of them had military backgrounds, of course. And a lot of them had personal contacts with people in the military. That somehow came up. Okay, so here's a question people ask me. So how did the T28 come about? How did this idea come up, and then how did this plane actually get physically built?
The idea came from Paul McCready, who is a champion glider pilot in his own right, and he came up with the idea from his background and experience. Well, depending on what's going on inside of a thunderstorm, you can armor plate an airplane and go there, and you can build it in such a way that you can survive. So that was the initial concept, and we pursued that after Project Hailswath. As a project, McCready had a person working with him, Robin Williams was his name, and he was the mechanic that structurally altered the airplane to put on armor-plated material on the leading edges and armor-plated the engine so it could survive. The design was to survive 3-inch diameter hail balls.
So you give Paul the credit for the idea for
Yes.
the T28?
That's right.
Was he the one? Was he the advocate for this? Was he the one who really pushed this through and got it to happen? Or how administratively then? How did that happen? Someone had to give the money. Someone had to do it, and then somehow this plane came to Rapid City, South Dakota.
We picked it up as an idea, wrote proposals for money to do it, and contracted with McCready to have Robin Williams actually do the armor plating.
And then he sold it to School of Mines for $1. Is that true?
I think we acquired it it may have cost us $1, I'm not sure.
Okay. I'm trying to remember now. The T28, this would be now the very late 1960s when the T28 is armored and almost ready to go.
Project Hailswath as a concept developed out of Project Hailswath, which I think was 1965 or 66, probably 66. And after the idea came out, we talked about it, we then picked up the idea, wrote proposals for it. It probably was the late 1960s by the time the airplane was physically here.
Now, to me, of course, I focus on the T28 because that's what I'm writing my article about. To you at the time, can you give me some idea of how the T28 fit in? I mean, was this a big part of the program, or was this just one more instrument, or what was this for you guys? You know what I mean?
And, how big a deal was it?
How big a deal was it?
Medium to big. In fact, you probably picked up with your conversations from, have you talked to Paul Smith?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. He's had the idea of picking up the next version of the armor-plated airplane.
Now you mean, the A-10.
Coming up.
Right.
And trying to put the pieces together now.
Yeah, this has been a long-running saga.
Yeah.
That's quite a project. That's a big plane.
It is.
So, you were still the institute director at the time?
Yes.
Does that mean that you were the head of the T28 program as well, or was there someone specifically tasked to take care of that, the T28?
A combination of Paul Smith and Gary
Gary Johnson?
Gary Johnson. Have you talked to him?
I have. I'm not sure, I can't remember whether yeah, I did.
He was the guy that did most of the work on the instruments on the airplane.
Right,
So
right.
it was a combination of Paul and Gary being the two people principally involved. At the time, most of the people in the Institute were working part-time on several different projects. So it was common for people to be working on more than one project.
Sure, because a lot of the money was soft money research grants, right? So as I understand, there were some bugs to be ironed out, some wrinkles to be ironed out when the T28 was first going into use. Can you tell me what you remember about that?
I remember the frustrations of trying to speed up Paul McCready and Robin Williams to get the bird here and ready to fly. And then there was a problem associated with getting who's going to fly the airplane. So we had at the time a person here by the name of Youngren who was a pilot, liked to fly. He had the unfortunate problem of having a physical disability of one arm being less than fully developed. So he flew the airplane for a while and finally decided it was a bad job and gave it up. And we were then able to pick up people that had flown the airplane in the military typically and were challenged by the idea of flying an airplane into a thunderstorm.
This is Bud Youngren you're talking about.
Bud Younger.
You said he was already around Rapid City. Did you folks at IAS already have some relationship with him, or how did he come to be that very first test pilot? Do you remember?
I don't really remember.
But you're saying he was not a military pilot, or he had not flown? He was not. But he was just a pilot.
He had, as I recall, he had connections with a well-known military pilot in South Dakota who's has a building named after him out at the Rapid City National Guard camp.
Not Joe Foss. Not Joe Foss.
No.
I couldn't tell you. But somebody talked to somebody, and somebody knew somebody.
And Youngren was kind of a protege. What the hell was his name?
I can look it up.
You can find the name of a major building out at the Rapid City Airport.
Okay.
He was a military pilot, very good leader. He finally died of MS.
Oh.
And they have a building out on the bases named after him.
So,
Anyhow, Youngren had good. Youngren was a protege of this individual,
right.
and he was typically around bugging us, and we had to hire him to fly an airplane.
So Bud decided that this was not for him.
Say again?
Bud Youngren decided that flying the T28 was not for him?
It was mutually agreed. I had spent some time trying to work with the pilot, work with Youngren to set up a routine of do this number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And we went through multiple sessions going through this on a dry run basis, trying to get him into the swing of things. And it didn't work, so we mutually decided it was time to drop him and go to somebody else.
Okay. Bud Youngren has passed away, right?
I believe so.
Okay. And this is how we come to your second pilot, Wayne Sand, right? Is this when Wayne came in?
I don't remember if Wayne flew the T28 or not. I believe he did.
Right.
Yeah. And there are periodic troubles with the T28 of engine failures. Wayne went through a dead stick landing out on Highway 79 south of town. Luckily, they brought the airplane safely down and survived the crash.
So you're the administrator for this. Were these just minor wrinkles, or was this sort of becoming a headache for a while?
Well, this is a major headache.
Major headache.
Yeah.
Because you had hoped to have this thing flying and running
Earlier than it did.
earlier, much earlier, a year or two earlier?
Like a year or two.
Okay. So tell me what you remember, tell me what your involvement was with the first field projects, the early field projects. Is this something that, when there was a summer project, for example, down in Colorado, is that something that did you personally go down to Colorado?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. But just in your role as supervisor, you were not there all summer, for example.
That's right.
You would just go down and check in, how are things going?
Periodically.
You know, you guys aren't screwing up here. And
Hopefully not.
So who was running that program? Would that be Paul then? Who was tasked to?
Typically, the T28 and its people were kind of like a task force to be assigned wherever the action was going that particular summer.
Right.
So the people who are working directly on the T28 would then pack up and go for maybe a week or two to fly their missions, and then they would come back.
So is there one person who was the head of that task force?
That evolved into Paul Smith.
That evolved into Paul Smith.
Yeah.
And of course, whoever was the principal investigator, I suppose, was calling the shots.
Yeah.
So can we go back to money for a minute, as long as we're on administrative things? As this went on, who was still funding this? The Bureau of Reclamation is now out of the picture, or do you remember?
Well, I think they still have some activity going with the Bureau of Reclamation and the National Science Foundation. And we pursued writing proposals and trying to get money to keep feeding the beast. And that was no small charge.
Eventually the T28 became, and I'm trying to remember the terminology here, eventually the T28 got sort of ongoing funding.
Yes, it did.
From NSF.
Yeah.
Do you remember when that happened, and were you involved in that still?
The question of should we give this a try and try to do this is something that I was involved with. Paul Smith was primarily involved with it.
In getting I'm trying to remember, it was like it became like a standing research facility.
Yeah.
Right. And you said that you moved on from IAS. You said the Dean of Engineering?
In 1975.
In 1975. So does that include IAS, or are you now sort of taken out of the IAS picture?
IAS reported directly to me.
Okay, so you became the boss for the next director of IAS.
That's
who
right.
was?
The next director, I think, was Arnett Dennis.
Okay.
Have you visited with him?
I don't think I have. I will do so. It's a name that comes up. I was not aware that he was director.
Yeah, after I left, Arnett was director for a while. Then he went down and joined the staff of the Bureau of Reclamation. Paul Smith was director for a while, and I kind of lost track of what was going on after that.
So did you keep a hands-on interest in IAS and the T28 as you were dean and then president of the School of Mines?
I was the dean of engineering for a year and then became president.
Right, that's what I thought. You must have been 75 to 87, I think you were president?
It started in 1975.
Okay. So even as president then, which was a much longer time, then you let them take care of IAS, and or did you still keep an active interest, or?
I gave them as much help as I was able to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I told them. I'll give you as much help as I can, which is what I did.
But you had a whole other barrel of monkeys to run around
There are a
after.
few other monkeys around.
Can you tell me about how IAS research at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology? What role did IAS? How prominent was research at this school as opposed to teaching and other activities? And what role did IAS play in that? That's a pretty open-ended question.
At the time that I came, and IAS was new, research or funded research was something that was almost unheard of in other departments. So we were the first unit to have a significant component of funded research. And that's probably one of the biggest impacts that IAS had on the School of Mines, was an acceptance of that as a legitimate role that other departments picking up as well.
Now you said legitimate role. You didn't say that a common thing. Was this seen as illegitimate, or was that something that they had always hoped for but just never quite achieved?
I think it probably depends on the individual. There'd be some individuals that say this is a teaching school, leave it that way,
Mm-hmm.
and others welcome the idea of doing something in addition and sponsored research.
And you make this distinction of saying sponsored or funded research as opposed to, what, a professor just looking into things during the summertime pursuing their own
Yeah.
interests.
It opened the possibility of having funded activity in the summertime, which for many teachers was a unique idea and welcomed by some and feared by others.
Mm-hmm. And now, of course, is far more prominent at School of Mines.
Much more.
Much more. So can we sort of switch now over to the science side of things? The content, the data and the research that was going on. When the T28 then got going as this research instrument, did you see it as a success? Were you pleased by the results you were getting from it? Was it a disappointment? Was it about what you expected? How'd it go?
It was about what I expected, in that looking at this in history, from the origins of the T28 and how it came into being to the fact that it became a recognized facility and sustained for something more than 30 years. I felt very good about it.
So at this time, were you doing active research? Were you writing papers? Were you using data that came from the T28 and these other instruments?
I would not.
You were doing administration.
Yeah.
You were busy just keeping the trains
Pushing
running.
paper.
Pushing paper.
That's right.
As you said, a weather modification advocate, as a supporter, an optimist, were you satisfied in your hopes that weather mod would be justified and supported scientifically?
It was moving down the road in that direction while I was here and while I was president, but it really went faster than I think it should have. The net result was, I think it got cut off at the pockets in South Dakota. South Dakota had a law on the books for a while setting up a statewide weather modification program that was in operation for 2 or 3 years, and eventually was terminated because of some opposition from some farmers out around Reliance, South Dakota. So it was an adverse public relation led to the termination of it, combined with the June 1972 flood occurred about the same time, which gave weather modification a bad name in South Dakota.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that flood in just a minute. You were talking about this, so the legislature passed a law saying we will have this South Dakota weather mod program.
Right.
Was IAS the main participant in that? Was that an IAS program?
It set up the program through the South Dakota Weather Control Commission. And it was operated by them with a director that they brought in, with Merlin Williams. I don't know whether you have his name on the list or not. Merlin was a scientist at the University of Wyoming that we had worked with cooperatively on a number of occasions.
So this was run out of Pierre.
Second,
This weather modification program for South Dakota was run out of Pierre.
that's right.
This was not, so what, did IAS have any participation in that program?
No formal role.
No formal role, because that was an operational program, not a research program.
That's right.
So the flood, I'm sure you remember, were you personally involved in the flood?
We escaped damage at our house.
Were you living near the creek?
Yes. No, not near the creek. We were a long ways away.
Oh, okay. But professionally, of course, in your role as director of the Institute,
We got lots of questions.
can you tell us that whole story?
Well, at the time this occurred, I had business in Aberdeen, and I'd flown to Aberdeen. We came back in and landed at the Rapid City Airport sometime in the evening. And when I drove back to Rapid City from the airport, it was raining very, very hard. And actually, I never got home that night. I stayed with Paul Smith in a different part of town, and got up the next morning and saw the disaster that resulted.
Because it was raining so hard, you could not get home?
Well, there's rained so hard the water was up, and the water cut off the traffic in various parts of town.
And your family was at home?
The family was at home.
You knew they were safe, you called them,
We
and
talked to them.
you knew they were in high ground,
Yeah.
so you just hunkered down at Paul Smith's house.
Yeah.
So, people obviously saw this devastation, people killed, and people knew that IAS had been seeding
That's right.
that day.
That's right.
So tell me, of course, I'm sure you must be tired of talking to people about this. But for the sake of history and posterity, can you tell us everything you remember about that?
We had documentation where the seed airplane had been, and the experiment at the time was one in which there was a choice of seeding material, a choice of no seed. Seed was silver iodide or seed with salt. And the choice that day was to seed with salt. So a couple of 100 pounds of ordinary table salt NaCl was released from an airplane earlier that day.
Oh, you literally used table salt.
Table salt,
Was it ground up, or is it just table salt?
finely ground.
Finely ground table salt, that's interesting. A couple 100 pounds.
Probably about 250 pounds. And this came about as a result of a happenstance. On an earlier occasion, we had a CD airplane with a salt dispenser attached to it, flying out near Ellsworth, and the airplane had been on a seeding mission and then ran into a traffic control problem, had to shut it off. So we have pictures. In fact, it showed up on the cover of the Journal of the American Meteorological Society, of a band of rain here and nothing over here, which was part of the background for that particular project of seeding choices, either silver iodide or salt.
So you can see where the salt stopped.
Yeah.
You can see this on a radar? Is that the kind of image you're talking about, or?
You can see that with your eyes.
Oh, with a photograph.
Yeah.
So salt seeding works. Salt seeding makes rain
In some cases, yes.
in some cases. So not you personally, IAS had been salt seeding that day.
Yes.
So this is obviously why you had questions asked of you.
Sure.
So people said, well, those guys caused, some people said those folks caused the storm. They made all this rain. Look what they did.
Well, there hasn't been any theory that I have seen that would explain a very heavy rain from salt seeding. I don't know of any mechanism by which a little bit of salt can produce 12 inches of rain.
Right.
And that's still true today, years after 1972.
So it has an effect, but not an effect that would explain that rain, that storm.
That's right.
But it's not the case that, some people said, well, by then the clouds would have blown farther east over the prairie. That's not the case. You were seeding those clouds.
Yes.
Yeah. So this became, you're the head of this institute. This became a public relations and even a legal headache for you.
We were sued.
Who sued, by the way? Were you involved in this, or was this just taken over by the university lawyers, or how did this work?
No, we were directly involved.
You were deposed, you had to work with lawyers,
Yeah.
and this ran on for quite some time.
Yeah.
And the result was,
Case was dismissed.
case was dismissed.
And also, during the time that the suit was going on, we were under constraints not to talk about the event.
Oh, I see. So if the press asked you, when the press asked you, you would say,
It's a case in court, I can't talk.
now that must have been frustrating to you.
Yes, it was.
You clearly firmly believe that you did not cause that flood or make that flood worse. Is that true to say?
That's correct.
You had no doubt in your mind.
No doubt.
But you could not talk about it until, I guess, years later, until this had gone all through the
Until the
courts.
case was dismissed.
Okay.
And I forget the year, maybe earlier this year, there's a publication was put out by MIT, had among other things an article on it, an article on the Rapid City flood, taking pot shot at us for being a part of the Bureau of Reclamation program. And I just prepared a short article in rebuttal to that I sent to the editor, and I'm waiting to hear from him to see what he has to say.
This year, you said?
I sent it in about a month ago.
And this is in what journal?
It's a paperback publication put out by the University put out by MIT.
Oh, I see. So you sent a rebuttal to...
The editor of that journal.
Oh, okay, of that journal, I see. Well, I will go look those up.
I have the document at home. It's Andy Detweiler's. He was looking for another reference and found this article as a sideline to his initial search.
That's interesting. Maybe I'll get that from Andy. So speaking of cloud seeding, weather modification, and back to the T28 specifically, how much of the T28 activity was for just basic cloud research, basic weather research, and how much was sort of for applied research, if you know what I mean? Weather modification, hail reduction
The
specifically.
initial question is what's going on inside of a thunderstorm?
Okay.
And it's been a very effective tool in answering that question.
So were most of the T28 projects specifically for hail reduction? To make it even simpler, were most of these seeding projects that the T28 was flying around?
I don't know, maybe, and I don't know what the fraction is. It's
Okay.
probably like half.
Okay. I'm checking off all my questions here. Well, I'll ask you this question. I talked with Harry about this. When I talked with people, I had no idea about this, but it just kept coming up. People bring up the Russians and also other foreign researchers. What was the international involvement between IAS and folks in other countries?
We had papers that our people delivered at many of these international conferences. So we were participants in many of them, many of the conferences with some of the results that came from various things that were being done here.
Was there a sense, this is one of those questions where do I have the right perception, or is this sort of stories that change later? Was there a sense that you were in competition with others to establish these cloud mechanisms, to understand what was going on with hail, weather mod, and just basic science?
I don't think the attitude was so much competition as it was people trying to learn together of what was going on to be able to use weather modification effectively.
So this was a friendly collaboration?
That's my impression.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to tell me about the T28 that You think I don't understand? Or maybe I do.
I'm it's kind of sad to see it go off to the museum, and I'm hoping for success with Paul Smith in his efforts to get an A10.
Yeah, you haven't been involved in that. You've just been watching like the rest of us, right?
The latter.
Yeah, it's a strange saga of this airplane itself. Just that, around it, it's had 3 or 4 lives by now. Well, Dick, I want to thank you very much. I do appreciate your time, and thanks for all the good information and stories.
Hope it's useful to you.
Okay, thanks very much.
You going to give me a copy of whatever the publication results from your work?
Oh, you'll see it. In fact, I may send you a draft as soon as I have a draft ready. So if there are mistakes, errors, omissions, I'd rather hear about it before it comes out than later.
I'll be glad to look at it.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Thanks very much.